Hey, thanks for watching. As we work our way through the book of Ruth, we'll be continuing this evening with Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. You'll notice instead of doing Facebook Live, I'm um, recording this earlier and posting it. I'll have it on Facebook and on YouTube. In part, that will let me kind of record it earlier and kind of work around my schedule better, but also be able to show my screen and kind of put the passage up so you can follow along as we read through it together. Um, I am encouraged by a lot of comments, so just want to say, hey, if this is helpful for you and you want to make sure you're getting it, you might want to like and follow the First Presbyterian Church, Covington, Tennessee Facebook page. If you're watching on YouTube, if you want to subscribe and like and do your notification bell so you'll know when these come out. But plan is to put them up at 6 p.m. on Wednesdays, and very much appreciate you using these and sharing with the, others you think they might be helpful for. So before we get in, I want to let y'all know about our an upcoming day of prayer and fasting. Um, Good Friday, April the 10th, our congregation, as well as our denomination, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, has called for us to join with the PCA and the Anglican Church in North America, and inviting other denominations to do that as well as we gather together to pray and to fast. And if you want more information on that, it's at our website, onepc-covington.org. We want to invite you, encourage you to participate as we take time to set aside time for prayer, to humble ourselves, to come in penitence, to pray for God's mercy, to pray for God to be with those who are suffering, for God to be with those who are serving and helping others. Just an unprecedented time, and a time for Christians to call on the one who is in control of all things, and pray for His aid, pray for His presence. Um, so hope you will plan to do that. April 10th, Good Friday. All right, so we're going to get into the book of Ruth now. We've looked at it last week. It kind of gave the setting. There was a woman named Naomi, who is the widow of a man named Elimelech. They were from Bethlehem in Judah. He was of the tribe of Judah, and there was a famine there, so they wound up leaving to go to Moab, a foreign land, and there their two sons married Moabite women. The father died, the brothers died, and the daughters-in-law and Naomi are the center of the story. And we kind of catch up with them as Naomi returns or begins returning to Judah. Let me move this, and I'm just going to read through the text, and then going to kind of come back and point out some things for you, and summarize a few points about this. So let me read this. Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, we will return to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So we catch up with them as they're returning. Um, they're returning from Moab, or Naomi's returning from Moab, and her daughters-in-law are going to accompany them. And Um, it's just a brief dialogue on the way. It's Naomi saying, go back. Why would you come? There's nothing. There's no hope for you to come with me. Encourages them to go back and find husbands in the land of Moab. And what we will see is as she does this, they both say, no, we're going to go with you. And she encourages them again. And Orpah says she will go back, and Ruth is going to go with her. And that's going to be what the story is about, is how Ruth is with her in the land of Judah. Um, so she's returning from from the country of Moab, and she's heard there that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. Now you'll notice here the Lord is in all capital letters, and I've point out quite often that is an indication that the translators are wanting you to catch on that this is using God's personal name. Lord with a capital L and a lowercase O-R-D is translating a word that means more generically Lord or Master. And the Lord in this way is referring to God's name, the name he revealed to Moses from the burning bush, the name of his personal name, the covenant name he's shown to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This God has visited his people. And again, that word visited um, isn't the idea that God's stopping by for a cup of tea one afternoon. This isn't just a social thing. The idea of visit is he has come among his people. It can mean come among his people in judgment. But here it's also come in blessing, because he is blessing his people, God's people, with food. And the word there, food, is lahem. It's the word that means bread. So in other words, he's giving them bread. And we catch on to this because they're from the town of Bethlehem, which means house of bread. And so there's a little play on words here, as the house of bread, which has been without bread, God has now given them bread. So anyway, she sets out from the place where they were to return to the land of Judah. But now Naomi says for them to return to their mother's house. And this should catch our attention, because it's fairly rare for it to say mother's house instead of father's house. A lot of the commentators tell us that when the term is used, it's not so much about your household as, by emphasizing the mother's house, is the idea it deals with marriage and having children. And so the idea of being with them, go back to mother's house, is a subtle way of saying return to your family, but not just to be with your family. Return to your family where there's hope of having a marriage arranged, where you have the hope of husbands. I want to say here that we're in a story where it all centers around a marriage and having sons and having children. And I think a lot of women might look at this kind of like, was this, the only thing we're good for is to have sons? And, understand what this book is saying in the context in which it's written, and which it still speaks to us today. This is not a patriarchal book. It was a time that was very much a man's world, where men made decisions and ruled, and understand a few things about that, though. This is a culture that didn't have a lot of the things that we take for granted. They didn't have social welfare systems to care for those in need. They didn't have a lot of structures and systems. The family provided the resources that we are used to from other means. The family cared for you in your age. The family provided resources if you were injured, if you were unable to work. You relied on your extended family, and a family requires men and women to have children. and to have children who are going to care for them in their old age. And part of the idea was that you're looking for the future. You're not living just for yourself. You're looking for the future generations that are going to be part of your family. And so that's part of the thing going on. And it's true that there very much is an element of men having control and being domineering. But Ruth is a story in which the main agents, the main protagonists are women. And we're brought into women's conversation and women controlling their destiny and the events that are taking place, at least on a human level. God is in control of it all, but we're looking at women leading, making decisions, and we're going to see more of how Naomi is guiding things. To better her and Ruth's life. So, look at it within the context of the culture that it's in, but also look at who are the agents and the one acting and the ones who are doing things. Um, so, with that said, it is crucial that they are somewhere where someone can provide for them, someone can protect, someone who's they're looking out for them. It's not that they don't contribute and they're helpless and they have to have someone, but a widow in ancient times was in a very vulnerable position, and realizing that it was needed that she have a structure that could provide support for her. Well, enough on that. Let me keep moving. So return to your mother's house, and then she says, "This is verse 8. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Naomi's blessing her daughters-in-law, and she's praying for these Moabite women. She's praying God's mercy on them. And again, you'll notice it's not just a generic gods or the Moabite gods, but she's praying for the God of Israel, her God, to bless them, to deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And that word is so hard to translate in English because it deals with God's kindness, His mercy, in His steadfast love. In the Psalms, we read about His steadfast love. It's the idea of God's love that's associated with His covenant promises to us. And so she is saying, "You have shown this kindness, this mercy, this loving kindness, this covenantal love with my sons and with me. And so now I'm praying God's blessings to provide for you what you have done for me, that God's faithfulness will be shown to them." And even as they return to the land of Moab, praying that blessing on them. And that blessing is that you may find rest. Not just a nap on a afternoon, not just that, but a home, a place to settle where they're secure, that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she's looking out for them. She cares for them, and her compassion for them, her care for them becomes evident through this. She kissed them, and they weep. And it is a sad time as people who obviously love each other are seeing a time of departure. Um, and so they say, "No, we're going to return with you." And so she's going to be insistent. The language she's using is almost short. She's saying, "No, there's no hope. Why would you return with me?" I'm going to go through this dialogue, but another thing I want to point out is this is an important thing that's going on as we read Scripture. There's times that we read things in the Old Testament that are just passed over very quickly, and then there's other things that take an extended time. And here's several verses of this conversation. And whenever the Bible kind of takes time to discuss at length what has gone on, that's where it's wanting you to focus. That's a way of saying, "Hey, this is important. Take note of what's going on." The famine itself was just passed over in a sentence, but this is, taking time as now she says, "Go." return to your mother's house. There's no hope. Turn back my daughters. Her daughters-in-law, she calls her daughters. Why would you go with me? Number one, are there any sons in my womb that may become your husband? In other words, can I provide another man for you? Is there someone else who I will give birth to who would grow and could marry you? This might be indicating the idea of what's called levirate marriage. This was a law in that we read about in Deuteronomy, and we see examples of in Genesis, where the idea was that if a man and wife did not have children, the man died, then his brother was to fulfill the obligation of marrying her, taking her into his home, and in part to make sure that someone is there to care for her, provide for her, protect her, but also would be a way of raising up someone who would bear the name of the brother. Or it might just be her saying, hey, y'all both married my sons. I have no more sons. Just kind of pointing out that, I don't have anybody else that could become your husband. I'm useless to you, is kind of what she might be saying. Um, if it is about the Levirate marriage, that is pointing us to another crucial element that's going to take place. That's kind of foreshadowing things. However it is, it's pointing to her. She's saying that she's really there's no hope for them to come with her because for as for her to come into another country, they're going to be it's going to be difficult for them without the connections and without the relationships, not being part of a tribe there, to be strangers, to find a new life and to find husbands and to find a new life for themselves there. And so, out of her care and concern for them, she's saying, you need to go back. There's no hope. And would you even wait for that? Wouldn't you marry to go back and to marry? Um, and she's saying that now in verse 13, no, my daughters, it is exceedingly bitter for me, for the sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So now she's just saying, I don't have any, there's no other sons. Coming with me would be hopeless. And she's also saying now, my life is bitter. My husband's died. My two sons have died. I've been in a famine. I've lost everything. God is against me. The hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She sees God as her enemy, and she's seeing that God is doing these things to her, and that she's bitter. Her life is not sweet or pleasant, as her name Naomi says, but her life is bad, and she's kind of saying, my life is almost cursed. If God is against me, you don't want to be around me. You're coming to someone who God is going to be against. That's not a good place to be. Almost kind of, if God's going to be striking me, you don't want to be around. And then they lift up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. In other words, Orpah does what her mother-in-law says and returns, but Ruth clung to her. And next week we're going to catch up with with Ruth staying with her and that conversation. But I want to point out a few things from this. First off, notice that um, both of them, both Orpah and Ruth, do good things. Um, in other words, Orpah's returning was not bad. She's doing what her mother-in-law has told her to do. She's obeying. She's submitting to that, and she is doing an appropriate and good thing. There's nothing that obligated her to do this. Ruth is going to stay, and that's a good thing. She the way she words it is polite, but she's saying, "I'm going to stay with you. I'm not going to leave." Um, both of them do good things, and I think it's a helpful thing that we see in Scripture, times where people have two options, and it's not between sin and doing what's right. The options are between two good and what's better, what's best. I think of um, Paul and Barnabas arguing over John Mark being with them. And there's a sense in which, it's not as though one was wrong and one was right. It was two different goals and two things in mind. And I think that's a helpful thing for Christians to remember because there's something about being in a church when we disagree with somebody, it's very easy for us to kind of take on a spiritual mantle and say, what I'm doing is the will of God, and anyone opposed to me is obviously a minion of Satan. And we can bring that into the church on some really goofy things. Like my opinion on the color of the carpet is led by the Holy Spirit. And so the Spirit's on my side. And if you disagree with me, obviously you're listening to the devil. Um, we can get that attitude pretty quickly on things. And we see that you can be good in different ways. You can choose between different goods, different rights, and we see that here. Let me kind of draw it in more of we've seen churches having to cancel, and a few weeks ago that was very much an option for most churches, and they were having to struggle through that decision. And I saw some churches that made the decision because that they wanted to continue to worship and stay open, and others made the decision that at that point they needed to close. And that decision really depended a lot about the makeup of the congregation, the situation on the ground, the local things they were dealing with. And there were a lot of things that people wrestled with in those decisions. And it wasn't a time for Christians to say, we're right and we're righteous and we're good, and you who don't do what we do, you're evil and wrong. When there's a judgment call and there can be different good reasons for doing something, um, Christians can differ on how best to be faithful to God. Now, obviously, there's clear cut right and wrong. I'm not saying this is relativism, but I'm just saying that there are different ways to be good, to glorify God. Um, the second thing is, and we'll probably pick up on this more, is note that God is not just the God over Judah and Israel. God is the God who is over Moab, who's over Egypt. God is God over all. And it is one of the things we see as Naomi hears about what God has done, even while she's in Moab. News of God's goodness comes to her there, and how she is blessing, the Moabite women with God's name and God's blessing on them. That she's, confident that He's Lord of all. She doesn't have to hope that the Moabite gods will take care of it. God is God even there, and kind of in with that is also the way God is, or the way God is at work with these good Moabite women. And I kind of it's a nice reminder for Christians to be good neighbors, that we love those who might disagree with us on things. We're not called to love our brothers and sisters. We're called to love our neighbors. In other words, we don't just circle the wagons around Christians and say, this is our clan and these are who we look out for. We show our goodness and love to everyone, all of our neighbors, regardless of their faith or their lack of faith, wherever they are. We kind of see a glimpse of that here and a picture of that. And, I think this is we're living in a time when we really have an opportunity to show that. We certainly want to care for one another as brothers and sisters, but we also have an opportunity to show love to all of our neighbors around us. And the final thing I want to point out is Naomi's bitterness. Read some of the commentaries and thoughts about the book, and they've rightfully pointed out it's an interesting story because that all of the characters are really good people. No one really does something wrong. The bad that's happening to them is a famine. It's external, and even that's being used by God for um, His purpose, His plan. But um, even that, and remembering that they're good people, Naomi is bitter as she talks to them and is without hope. She has her doubts. She is looking at God, even though she's asking God's blessing on them, and she's looking on God as one who is opponent of hers, who's raised his hand against her, a God who is an enemy to her. And they're certainly understandable the horrible things she suffered and dealt with. We understand how she got that way, but the fact is, at this point, um, Naomi is a bitter old woman. She's not happy with her life. She has no hope, and her attitude isn't cheerful and trusting that God's going to do great things. She's not exercising incredible faith. And I think this is something we need to see real. We don't need to polish over this and clean it up. We need to see the real people. And we know real people like that. And we can be tempted at times to have doubt and wonder if God is not our enemy, and to have bitterness and resentment about things. And I want to point that out, not just kind of say, look at this person, because part of the story is how she goes from this situation to joy and blessing. But part of the story also um, is that God still blesses her. God still uses her. God still provides for her. God doesn't say, when you get your attitude right, then I'll come in and rescue you. There's no sense of God saying, when you show real faith, then I'll come in and do something. God is at work blessing Naomi even when she's bitter and angry and doubting. God's faithfulness doesn't depend on us being perfect, model, believing, faithful, good people. God deals with real people, with real hurts and real doubts and real struggles. Um, God is going to bless Naomi, um, and God is going to um, provide for her and use her to be a blessing to others. But I do want you to see that we who trust in God, I mean, she still believes that God's there. She still trusts God enough to call blessings on him. She still loves him and trusts him enough that she's going to return. But it's not so pure that she's not hurting and angry and bitter. But what wonderful news that our faith, matter how weak, um, no matter how riddled with doubts it becomes, it's only a mustard seed grain that's needed, mustard seed that's needed. And so, if you have times of doubt, times of struggle, look at Naomi. Um, God still blesses her and uses her. Um, her He doesn't rely on her getting her act together before he does. Well, I appreciate you watching. Again, we'll be loading up the next lesson next week as we look at Ruth's response of how she stays with Naomi. Take care. Thank you.